Okay, students, so for the next couple of weeks, we're going to actually be working on one last major value assignment. And this one is going to utilize your black charcoal pencils and your white charcoal pencils and a piece of toned paper. So when I say toned paper, basically I mean some piece of paper that falls somewhere in the middle of the value range. It's not completely white, it's not completely black, sort of like our last two assignments. The first one we started with white paper and we built up the shadows. The other one we started on a completely blacked in piece of paper and concentrated on the lights. For this one, we're going to start in the middle and we're going to push those values in two different directions. We're going to work up some shadows and we're also going to work up some lights. Now, working on toned paper is awesome, or working on a toned ground. It is a great way to sort of just add value to your piece. Just in the fact that the paper has a color sort of imbues everything with a sort of unified lighting, a unified sort of sense of like everything's bathed in the same glow, the same color. It just brings everything together, and it's kind of a cheap and dirty way of adding color to a black and white drawing. It's often used even in painting as a way of starting paintings out. I'll show you some examples of that. But what follows is going to be some examples of black and white media on tone ground, just so we can talk about some of the tips and tricks. So this one in particular is pretty successful. Uh, One thing that I want you to notice right off the bat is that whenever they fill in, when this artist filled in their white or their black charcoal, they didn't completely obliterate the paper underneath. Some of the color of the paper has to always come through because essentially what we're trying to make is a monochromatic drawing of the color of the paper itself. So if you add too much white or too much black, you sort of take away that color from coming through, and it sort of separates the drawing from the background or from the ambient glow of the light of the paper, the color, that everything that's supposed to like tie it all together. So down here on the table, which is probably, going to be the brightest thing in the drawing, even down here with the sort of mark making that they used, notice the sort of cross hatching, you get bits of gray coming through. And even in the shadow, it gets pretty dark. There's still bits of that gray coming through. And I'll show you in the demo too, ways of using your paper as a means of making that happen. But also notice here on the surface of the bag, the front, how just scumbled on the sort of hatches are. The hatches are very light and they go across the form just enough so that the gray remains coming through. Something to keep in mind. So here's a great example. This red paper really makes the skeleton look interesting because everything's bathed in that red light. But I want you to notice how little drawing is actually done in this particular one. So much of this is done with negative space. Just these wispy sort of bits of charcoal plugged into the negative spaces bring the form of the skeleton out. And what's used is just little bits of white, mostly indicating highlights or just slightly more lit areas. And that brings that form out of the page, more three-dimensional. Here's another great example. When we look at a skull, we sort of associate it with being kind of an off-white color, kind of a creamy white or something. And, when you look at this, it's quite convincing, even though the whole thing is blue, because it's all unified. It's all bathed in that same blue light. Now, I want you to notice not only the negative and positive space, but the way that that negative and positive space creates relative value. So the top of the skull actually has very little white added to it. Yeah, there's some here and here, sort of in the major parts of like where the light is being reflected. Or right along this edge, this little crusty edge here, it's catching a lot of light, so you see it as a highlight. But the background has been darkened. And that darkening of the background just makes the blue of the paper up here seem lighter. So not a lot of white actually had to be added. In fact, that's one of my major tips that I want to tell you is white is probably the easiest charcoal media to overdo. So lay off it a little bit. Don't overdo it because you can put too much on and it becomes too solid and it loses its three-dimensional quality. Instead, build more up in your dark charcoals, kind of using a hatching technique, very much like what we did in our last assignment, to allow the color of the paper to come through, and then add, selective amounts of white in the areas that you need it. Down here, it's really interesting. The negative space, because of the pedestal it was sitting on, is now colored white. And that, in turn, sort of makes this part of the blue seem darker. Even though there's a little shading on it, a lot of it just seems darker by the relative value. Here's a nice piece. I kind of feel it lacks some sort of, defining line of a tabletop or any background. Not that that's necessarily bad, because this is such a dark presence on the page. It's been really rendered darkly. However, I want to use this as an example of something that you kind of want to avoid when using black and white charcoal. Now remember, you're trying to make values of the color of the paper. And in this case, there was a few instances where the student sort of mixed their black and white charcoal together, and they got this third tone, this kind of bluish gray. Do you notice that? Kind of these bluish gray tones. And they seem out of place. They don't feel like, part of the green value scale that they were trying to create, but sort of a third color that just doesn't really belong there. So just try to avoid mixing those colors if possible. Sometimes it'll happen a little, but for the most part, just avoid it. Another beautiful example, very stunning. Look at how the bottom of this pelvic bone down here just glows. These hip bones, these fins, just really seem like they're glowing. And yet, notice there's no white used at all. There was no necessity to use white to make this brighter. Instead, the artist darkened the negative space around those areas, which then in turn made these areas lighter. Even notice that on the cast shadow on the table. So much of that cast shadow is really a lot just the color of the paper. There's white put around it, and that in turn kind of made this area darker. Yes, some charcoal has been scumbled in there, just a little bit of hatching of black charcoal to deepen it in some of the core, but for the most part, a lot of it is just the color of the page. So you'll be using a lot of sort of positive and negative space in this, and pushing some areas darker to make other things lighter. But also just notice the amount of detail on this. Really lovely contrast, from the brightest brights where the light is really hitting the inside of this bone to the dark areas in the background back here. And how effective the sort of hatching works to allow the color of the paper to come through. So here's one. Sometimes I like to show examples that sort of contradict what I teach you. And that's because, there's not always just one way of doing something. So if you look at this, it kind of goes against what I said about mixing the black and white charcoal, right? You see that gray tone in the face. However, it feels convincing. And why is that? Well, I think you can tell which way the light is coming. It looks like it's coming down this direction, right? Coming from behind the skull off to the left-hand side. But it almost seems like it continues over here and might be, something off the page, might be bouncing off something metallic or something blue. And that reflected light comes back over here and bounces into the face of the skull, which is actually in shadow. So you get these like sort of subtle reflected lights in here that seem slightly altered based on whatever the light is bouncing off of. So really, this was actually a very observant student, someone that could tell that there was a difference quality in light in the way that things were reflected over here. Again, though, just a beautiful piece. Another paper bag, and I just want to, reiterate, look how little drawing on the bag is happening itself. So much of what makes this pop out from the page is the darkness of the background back here and the lightness of the tabletop that it's sitting on. So much of that is what brings this bag forward. And the color of the paper up here ties everything together. All the color of the bag and the darks and the background on the table, that sort of creamy orange tan color is just coming through and tying everything together. Now here's one where, now normally during these value drawings, I'd much prefer you to avoid contours. However, sometimes contours are there for a reason. And when you use them, the idea is to use them in a way that they help the illusion. They help describe things without making it look cartoonish or just clumsy. So because there was nothing done in the background, the skull's been drawn just on green paper, and there's no tabletop per se or any background back here. The student almost had to use some outlining to make it work. But notice this. Notice how the line goes from black, then all of a sudden suddenly sort of turns into a white line that feels like it becomes a reflected light. Like light that hits the table and bounces back and reflects on this side of the antler. Very cool. Also up here, you see some of the line is dark, like as if it's in shadow, and then it goes to white again, where it describes reflected light. So just a really neat way of sort of using those lines to help describe the values that you're seeing in a sophisticated way. Not only that, the line widths seem to vary. It's a good idea to always sort of make your lines either, maybe start thick, but then get thinner in other areas, and then thick again, and then sort of disappear where they're not needed, just to vary it so they don't seem like one continuous dark outline. This piece is great because it really shows sort of the start of the process to the finished piece. So if we start on the left-hand side, you get a sense of how this student prepared the project. It looks to me as if they used fine charcoal. It's not the only way of doing it, but this was a very successful, thoughtful way of sketching out their image using sort of gestural marks and sort of pre-planning where some of the shadows were going to go. But then as we creep over to this side of the page, you notice how much more three-dimensional and how much more polished everything looks. And a lot of that is simply just, for one, the addition of this dark background really creates a refined edge and pops that skull forward. It makes it pop out from the darkness. This thing now seems to glow, where over here it's very flat. And so this comes forward. White is used pretty sparingly, mostly just on little parts of the bone that seem to be reflecting light or little edges that might be catching some light. But for the most part, it's darkness. Even in the socket of the skull, which seems a little bit illuminated, right? It seems as if there's light finding its way into this crevice. It's mostly dark charcoal, just rendered carefully with sort of hatching. Carefully building up some values and leaving others a little bit lighter, as well as in this socket. So another human skull, and just look how monumentally sized this is. It really fills the composition. And that is a smart thing to do, because when working with these value drawings, you really want to have the room to work. Not only that, it just makes for a better composition. It's more visually impacting to fill the space. One of the things I want to show you with this, well, besides the fact that look how little white, again, is actually being used. I mean, there's a little bit here on the edge of the skull, a few places here and there. And though this isn't done, I want you to see, look how the student started their drawing with a very light white line. And I think that's very wise. That's another great way of doing this. One, because that white is so fine and so thin, it's really easy for it to disappear. It'll go away quite nicely once you start adding the other values on top. So here's some other examples. These are just some studies, I think, for paintings. I'm pretty sure these were Toulouse-Lautrec. I believe we're studying horses or something. But again, just, kind of in the sketchier manner, just showing muscle anatomy of this horse's leg and how the marks sort of go across the form, sort of like a cross hatching, to help describe the volumes. Here is a Leonardo da Vinci, and this one in particular will be helpful for anyone that chooses to do the paper bag, because one thing I want to point out is when you have something like fabric or paper or whatever, and it seems to fold, I don't know about you, but when I think of fabric, I think of it being sort of flowy. And, and to my mind, that automatically makes me want to make sort of curved lines. But the truth is when those kind of, you know, fabrics fold, they tend to get very geometric shapes, triangular, rectangular, sort of trapezoidal, just shapes that curve and bend with sort of sharp edges. And I just want you to notice all of that in this piece. How the shadows get deeper in the core of the folds and then they sort of transition outwards into lighter shadows. How the light really hits the top of a fold and then transitions very subtly into the valleys of that fold. This is a good example of trying to see to make these folds look right. The other reason I love showing this is I've always been a proponent of starting your drawings very gesturally, and this is just a great example of that. Look how loose and scribbly and messy this drawing starts up here, and how it ends up becoming such a polished and beautiful piece down here. Just a good example. Now this sort of work is also used in painting, using black and white media on a toned ground, and this will help you a lot if you go on to do painting or anything like that. So understanding this concept is very useful. Oftentimes painters would use sort of this burnt sienna color, sort of this brownish, reddish brown earth color, and then a cheaper yellow ochre color that sort of denotes, I don't know, the warmth of the sun, and use those colors as basically a tone underneath their painting. And then what they would do, it was actually do their paintings in black and white, because it was the best way for them to concentrate on the most important thing, which was value. Color was a bonus, but value was what really gave things form. And oftentimes shops would advertise their artwork like this. And when a patron would come into a painter's shop, they would see a painting that was done in black and white on a toned ground, and they'd say, "Oh, I love it. I like the expressions. I love the composition. Everything about it just works for me. Go ahead and paint it in color now." And then the painters would take a very thin layer of paint, because those colors were much more expensive back then and it was harder to come by. And then they would paint over these garments with thin layers of color. And then that would be the finished piece. But very interesting. Wet media works with this. Here's some sort of like white tempera paints and probably black ink sort of used together. A student example from my figure drawing class, again using white tempera paint and ink, and just the sort of transparency of the thinned out layers of ink give you all these different ranges of value. So sort of medium shadows to light shadows, and how the color of the paper still finds a way to come through. And the white is still used pretty sparingly, just mainly to show highlights. And even where it is put in thicker, it's still added thin enough that there's enough of this color coming through that it all feels unified and bathed in the same light. And finally, one that I found on the internet recently by a different instructor, and I thought it was funny because of sort of the COVID thing and the crazy toilet paper scare that happened earlier on. And so this was just a really great example of black and white media on toned paper. And this time they're using a white pen and a black pen. So sort of similar to what we did in crosshatching. This could be an option for you. You could do a drawing of toilet paper, and I think it would work really well. I love how they used bracelet shading to really help describe the three dimensionality of the forms. Notice how these curves all sort of, the mark making moves in the direction that the toilet paper would roll, and they kind of bend and curve over the form to help give it that three-dimensional illusion. Okay, so I'll talk more about this in my demo, my hands-on demo. But for this assignment, what I'd really like you to do is either, a paper lunch sack, or if you can't find that, then I guess, just a regular paper grocery bag. Those are kind of weirdly shaped, but a paper grocery sack would work great. You know, 2 or 3 rolls of toilet paper would work to make a great, black and white media drawing. Or if you just happen to be one of those crazy people that have skulls around your house, you can do one of skulls. We usually do that one in the classroom because we have a bunch of skulls there, but who knows? Maybe you have some, and that would be okay too. Just remember to look back at this slideshow if you need help. If you want to see these examples again, a lot of times learning art is about really looking at what works and what doesn't work, and trying to, take that and use it in your own. All right, thank you.